Two stalwarts of the Future Politics panel, Jonathan Gibson, who is a Pinsker Fellow and a political commentator, and Samara Gill, who is also a political commentator. And it's Bring Your Family to Work Day, because Mirabai is your mum, isn't she?
Yes.
And Mirabai's here.
From Australia, yeah.
She come from Australia?
Yeah, just to see you guys, actually.
That's very
Not
nice.
me, but yeah.
Well, it's wonderful to meet her just now. So, and she's over there. I think she's outside, actually. So, good morning, Mirabai, and good morning to all of your family in Australia as well.
They're all watching.
They're all watching, I should hope so. Right, let's start with the big stories that are making the cut this morning. So we've been talking about this morning, that essentially the Conservative Party in major trouble at the moment, and this big survey saying they're going to be left with fewer than 100 MPs, 15,000 people polled in that. Now, Claire Coutinho is trying to push it back onto the front foot, and she then says, right, Labour's dangerous net zero plans would leave Britain at the mercy of China. This is the Energy Secretary. She said that Labour's pledge to convert Britain to clean power by 2030, which, by the way, is 5 years earlier than the Conservatives, would leave the UK over-reliant on Chinese-made metals, cables and batteries, just as Europe was weaning itself off Russian oil and gas. So she says that essentially Labour is going too fast too soon, and that China then has far too much power. Now, I think this is a bit rich, because I don't remember anyone asking me whether I wanted net zero, and it started with 2050, then it went to 2035 with the Tories, now it's 2030 under Labour. Did anyone ask you, Jonathan?
No, but I guess what the argument would be was that we live in a representative democracy in which MPs are supposed to represent the interests of the public. We don't have a direct democracy in that we vote on every single policy issue. However, you know, if you feel very strongly about particular issues, they are represented through our elected officials, of which we have a choice.
Right, Samara.
I mean, when you say sort of representing the interests of the people, I think net zero is not on top of everyone's mind at the moment. I think
agree.
Putting food on the table, NHS, public infrastructure, these are the things that people care about. And sort of the target of clean power by 2030, it's a classic Keir Starmer flip-flop policy. He's actually scrapped the $28 billion that it takes to fund this. So he's saying one thing publicly, but he doesn't have the money yet again to back it up.
So that's really interesting. When you look at to do this, Labour has to then quadruple offshore wind generation, triple the amount of energy coming from solar panels, and doubling onshore wind capacity. I'm telling you, that is not what people want. And there's something else that people always message in about, is they don't want pylons marching across this country.
So, exactly. Sorry, I just want to pick you up actually on what you just said, because I think you just said nothing in a sentence.
Well, we can talk about that.
What the representative democracy?
And then you can answer me.
Sure.
I think that we do have a representative democracy, but it's based on voting for a manifesto. Now, you're going to say that all of the parties had net zero in their manifesto, but they didn't. They had a little page tucked away in the back with no detail. They didn't say, Jonathan, this is how much net zero is going to cost you a year. Nobody voted for being impoverished by it, representative democracy or not.
Okay, so I think there's 3 points that we got to talk through. The first is whether it's popular and people want net zero. Repeated polls have shown that people want action on climate change. People want the government. Yes, you can look at this. There's Pew Research that's done it. There's YouGov that's done it.
People don't want to pay for it.
Thank you.
People realise, and the question particularly asked, would you suffer some economic hit in order to promote a safer and more globally sustainable future? And people said yes. And if you particularly look at young people who are worried about, you know, climate change and what the impacts are going to be in the humanitarian crises that arise because of it, they're very, very promoted.
But no one has told us how much. Suffer an economic hit could mean a penny. No one has told us how much.
So that depends on the way in which we go about it, right? So whether we achieve net zero through, for example, investing in particular forms of energy or becoming particularly reliant on particular countries makes a massive difference. So it's very difficult to give an exact number when we don't have a clear-cut plan of how we're going to achieve it.
There's a new report out last week saying it's going to cost £15.5 billion.
So that's an estimated ballpark, but again, it depends on which strategy we adopt. If we adopt Keir Starmer's strategy, if we adopt a nuclear power energy, if we adopt an offshore wind power, they all have different
René's
costs.
point is very valid here, because it was tucked away in the manifesto. I don't think, and this is what I said yesterday, is I think these political parties need to have a contract with the people where you say, these are almost legally binding. I'm going to vote for you because this is what you want. Now, when you say to people, we're going to find £15.5 billion, by the way, we can't afford the NHS.
Yeah.
Do you think people are going to say, oh, that's fine, I'll have loads of pylons coming across the country. I'm very happy to have lots of wind turbines sitting onshore. I'm not sure people are happy with that.
I mean, it goes down down to the crux of it. Wind and solar cannot power this country anyway. So the debate kind of gets cut off at the root there because it just doesn't even make sense. But we have got numbers. We've got 28 billion. We've got the 15.5 billion as well. And they have done the numbers and they've said that's why they dropped the 28 billion sort of pledge, is because it would lead to higher taxes and borrowing. So it is going to affect people's pockets.
I think, Jonathan, you make a very valid point, actually, when you say, well, we don't really know which way we're going to go. When would you get in a car if they haven't quite worked out how the brakes are going to work?
No, but the point is, these parties as in the Labour Party have laid out their plan for it, the Conservative Party have laid out their plan of it, and it's the role of think tanks, the role of the media, to scrutinise that and look in terms of whether that is feasible. And on your point about contracts, that's, I think, it's an excellent idea. However, we unfortunately live in a society in which we're responding to different environmental factors. Imagine, for example, during COVID, if the government had to have a contract in terms of what it wanted to do, and suddenly you have this virus coming along.
Well, actually, I would have quite liked in COVID for the government to have done
Actually, they're very different because we were dealing, particularly at the beginning, with an unknown virus and we had no idea of the impact. We know exactly the impact of going to net zero.
Climate change.
Let me just ask you about the mess we're in currently, because our nuclear power stations are 100% foreign owned. Our gas and coal are 85 and 100% foreign owned. Our offshore wind turbines are 83% foreign owned. In an increasingly insecure world, I would suggest foreign ownership of essential services is utter madness.
I completely agree. I mean, look, this is someone who's banned from China. Actually, I say our reliance on China.
You're banned from China?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
There was a great quote from Claire Cortino in here. She basically said, in terms of energy, we've seen a period where continental Europe has had to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. We can't do that to just be dependent on China for critical minerals in return.
And it's absolutely fascinating. With one hand, we're warning about the threat from China, which we've heard repeatedly, but we're all buying Chinese goods. And now we're going to allow China to invest and own our infrastructure. It's utter lunacy.
Yeah.
So there was this was actually off the back of a really interesting report that was released from Russo, which is a think tank in the UK, and they talked about the importance of how we invest. This is about how we achieve, these policies and these ambitions, and where we're going to invest, not in, for example, the traditional silica industries and developing our own reusable fuels and renewable fuels, which isn't reliant on foreign interests, because we've seen, obviously, with Ukraine and Russia, for example, the impact that's had in terms of over-reliance on authoritarian regimes. I think this is something that the country more broadly, not just in the context of environmental ambitions, but more broadly is going to have to think about quite closely.
So I was just looking at the figures this morning. If you look at fracking, for example, which certain political parties, and I would be quiet about which political parties believe in, and the US and Canada have got 100 years of energy security now because they allow fracking. Surely a much more sensible thing is to allow fracking in the short term, build SMRs, the small modular reactors. Yes, I agree, we need renewables, but we need also to have energy when the sun isn't shining and when the wind isn't blowing.
We need storage. So even if we were able to generate all of the electricity we needed from renewables, we cannot store it. We don't even know how to do that.
We really overlook nuclear. I think that if nuclear got a rebrand and was seen as clean energy, which it is actually...
Well, in fact, they have changed the labelling. It is now defined as clean energy.
Well, that's great to hear, actually. I didn't know about that development, but it does make sense. Nuclear is something we can do on our soil, have full control of, and would be able to power the entire grid.
So yes, we're really rubbish at building them.
Yeah, but
we're rubbish at building everything. I mean, in this country, it feels like, look, with fracking, unfortunately, as much as I'd love it to be a short-term solution, it takes about 15 years in order to develop the infrastructure for fracking. So it doesn't quite work. For example, when there was the recent oil price hike, it would have taken too long to sort of solve that through fracking. But if Ed Davey had said in 2012, that we should have supported the nuclear power plants rather than being like, oh, it will only be built by 2020.
Well, I think it was Nick Clegg, wasn't it?
Nick Clegg, yeah. Right.
But we don't have a time machine to go backwards. But if we just keep sitting here saying, it will take too long, we'll never build anything.
But I think it's better to invest in nuclear power, which is more powerful. You can do much more with it. It creates jobs.
Well, you can turn them on and off as well.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a really interesting point. We're really bad at everything. There is no long-term strategy for anything. By the time we talk about something, I was thinking the other day about the Heathrow runway. I mean, where's that? Where are the
HS2?
HS2. So we then decide we're going to build it. Then we decide we're not building that. I mean, it's pure lunacy, and I think it's also about a lack of leadership.
Can I, just before we move on, can I read one text, actually, because I think it's relevant, from Robert. Morning team. Net zero equals dark ages. Cost equals who knows. Energy stories equals China. Slaves to a country that could and would destroy us.
As in, what, you're asking my opinion? I don't agree with Rob. I think the catastrophe is if we don't take some serious action globally, and this is a global project on climate change, are very worrying, and we're already seeing that happening now.
So let's now go to the other big story this morning, which is the front page of the Sunday Times. This is the Sunday Times this morning. The Tories may be left with fewer than 100 MPs. This is going to make very salutary reading for the Prime Minister, because even his own seat is in trouble. They are in serious trouble. Labour now on the current poll, 45% of the vote share, 19-point lead over the Conservatives. According to some of them, the Savanta poll, Reform UK on 16%. So a massive sort of flux going on. Many of the cabinet at the moment are going to lose their seats if this happens. And the question is what the Tories do. Now, there's another great article this morning, which is in the Telegraph, and this is from a senior minister saying, actually, the public has just stopped listening to what the Conservatives are saying, and Rishi Sunak should call an early election to shift the spotlight to Labour. He went on to say voters are tired of Conservatives navel-gazing and expressed fears the public are no longer paying attention to any positive message coming out of the government. Now, this is quite an interesting one, because what does Sunak do? Because he is... Look, I don't think he's a leader. I think he's a good middle manager, probably, vaguely. But what would you do if you're Rishi Sunak? Because you're seeing your poll ratings being decimated. We talked earlier, actually, about when the election is, with the longest answer ever that I've ever heard.
With which we disagreed.
With which we disagreed. Now, I've had calls this week from people telling me when the election is, OK? So we've got the local elections coming up, which basically aren't going to be about local issues. Keir Starmer's already kick-started their general election campaign. So what does Sunak do?
I mean, I agreed with what a lot of this article said, because, look, Rishi is hanging on to power at this point. He wants a later and later election, and he thinks maybe he can scrimmage together the numbers. It's not probably going to happen, but I agree with what this article said. It said the spotlight should go on to Labour. Labour's kind of been in the shadows too far. They should be spotlit, and they should be exposed, because they have basically no policies to run on.
That?
I would basically announce the election and then see what Labour's going to say. That's what he needs to do. Call the election.
But what if they say stuff that people really like?
I doubt that they will, because of what they've been saying so far, as we were speaking about this morning. They're running on net zero.
That's a really interesting point. You're saying he's so up against the wall, you put everything on black. You basically put everything on red or black or whatever it is.
Yeah, or like at least just expose Labour, because they're actually not really out there at the moment. They're not being exposed for their lack thereof policies. It was an interesting quote I read on or saw on a podcast that said Labour are trying to get into 10 Downing Street by saying as little as possible. Yes. It is true.
So does he go for a May or June election?
Ooh, as soon as possible, I reckon. May.
Yeah.
What would you do, John?
No, I'd go later, and I think he's trying to go offensive, but I think
What do you mean by later?
As in the later, I think it's hopeless either way, personally, but I think the later
October,
the better.
December? January?
As soon as he can get anything that can sort of pull himself in an upward trajectory.
So what happens when they lose 1,000 council seats in May?
It'll be devastating for the Conservative Party, and I think it's because he's been trying to appeal to everyone, and in a sense got nobody in his party to really back him. Not the sort of far right, not the One Nations, not the people are very concerned about immigration. None of the factions seem to be happy, and all of them at some point seem to have been sort of displaced, whether you're a big Johnson fan, whether you're a Trussite, whether you're a Penny Mordaunt fan, Tom Tugendhat.
Does this say that
Robert
a broad
Jenrick.
church, which is what the Conservatives love saying, just doesn't work for a political party? You can't have
seven
that broad church.
groups in the Conservative Party.
I'm not convinced that it suggests that a broad church doesn't work. What I suggest is that when you have these splinters through fights, through removing leadership, through having these pretty brutal... I remember I was on every week debating about these leadership elections for like 8 weeks, where different leaders were taking chunks out of each other. That's really going to ruin this broad church, which maybe previously and for 13 years they had done quite well at maintaining.
Let's just pause for the moment, because I want to pick you up on that after this break, and I want to talk also about Samara's point about the Labour Party and the fact they're doing very little at the moment, and that is their electoral strategy. We'll be back after this break. This is TalkTV.
Hey, very good morning to you.
Thanks for joining us.
You're with TalkTV, on TV, on radio, online.
And we're on your smart speaker.
Now, you ain't going to have an EVIT, me old shiners, but a new report is calling for a new definition.
back to Weekend Breakfast time, 8:45. We're in the middle of Future Politics panel with Jonathan Gibson, Samara Gill, Dr. Renee, myself. Now, I just want to go back to what you were saying, Samara, about Labour's not doing anything at the moment. And we have the local elections coming up, and we're imperative for that. The Mail front page. This Angela Rayner story is not going anywhere, is it? So he's got that. He's fighting that on one front. But also there's this other great story this morning, which is in many papers, including The Sun. Now, Labour has now got a new row over the use of the Union flag. So MPs are calling for it because Labour is now using the Union flag as part of their electoral material. And MPs are calling it for it to be axed in campaign leaflets across some MPs. But it's really interesting which MPs. So essentially, Keir Starmer now says he's proud to fly the Union flag after a number of MPs complain that its use on party leaflets is putting off ethnic minority voters. So this is being raised at the issue at recent meetings of the BAME group in Westminster by London members of the parliamentary party. And one of the MPs said, I can see how using the Union flag works in some places, but it's definitely detrimental in university towns and in heavily BAME areas. I get the sense this is another problem for him.
Are we joking? This is literally the most ridiculous thing. The Union Jack not being allowed to be used in a British election campaign.
That's exactly what we're talking about.
It is the British... it's a British flag not being used for a British election. That's what we're going on, because it's not inclusive.
What does it say, Jonathan, about the success of multiculturalism in the UK?
It shows that there are areas that have failed in terms of effective integration, and I think that they need to be, there's lots of ethnic areas and there's lots of minorities that are proud to fly, the British flag, and people who have come over, as refugees or asylum seekers or whatever, who are very proud of the British flags, that others or particular groups, you mentioned university students, still see it and still have their head as sort of this fixed idea of it's connected to colonialism in the past and history and whatever. And it might be, it's got a connection, but what it can be is reimagined, and it depends on who's flying that flag. And I completely support Keir Starmer in him saying we should be proud to sort of reclaim the British flag. It's not a symbol of a fringe, or it's not a symbol of... No, I don't think so. I think the majority of the British public, vast majority actually, support it being used in campaigns.
I would agree.
And I think...
But what René's asking is it going to be a problem for him in terms of the parliamentary party? Because he's trying desperately to unify, detoxify the party on the back of Corbyn. Is this now going to start to unravel? And that's the point that Samara was making, which is actually he's trying to basically hold the jelly together, and it may be that the jelly fragments as we come towards the general election.
I'll be honest, I don't think this is the issue that will do him. I mean, he's managed to keep somehow his party together. What about
Rayner and this, and then the next one, and then the next one?
He's done an unbelievable... he's had the Middle East conflict, he's had several very sort of divisive issues which should be going through the party.
Well, that's quite interesting, actually, because do you not think that when we come to an election, whenever that may be, May or December, that when Galloway's... Or October, when Galloway's party stands up in those particular areas that don't want the Union Jack, that the Middle East conflict will come back to the fore for him?
It might well, but it's not going to be what takes Starmer down. I mean, the majority of the country, I'd say, are fiercely supportive of the British flag being used, and particularly the areas which he's trying to appeal to.
But when you say it's not going to take Starmer down, shouldn't we not even be focusing on this? I mean, it's crazy that the Labour Party seems to focus on the little minutiae things, the little culture warsy things, instead of, have I heard a policy yet? Probably not. So it is strange that they're focusing so much on the Union Jack being on a banner that's being handed out.
And apparently some of them are very unhappy. There's not even a Labour emblem on their election material.
I mean, the Labour emblem, they maybe should have that on.
Well, they probably should.
I don't think Keir Starmer wants this to be an issue.
No, of course he doesn't
want it to be an issue, and I don't think it will be. I really don't think it will be. And in terms of the policies, I mean, there are policies he's established. I think every party in opposition has an incentive to not be super specific and lay out 50 things, because obviously, it leads to an offence. But he has talked about things from his fiscal and monetary policy that he'll be using, his policies on vapes, his language around immigration, his policies around the right to buy, his policies around housing. He has come out with content.
So let's just move on to the idea that Keir Starmer does win and forms the government in the next election. So a lot of people who are gunning for the Labour Party are saying, well, when Labour gets in, they're going to sort out all the problems this country faces, and that's certainly what they want you to believe. But one of the biggest problems they're going to face is what's going on in the NHS, and René and I know this only too well. And the NHS, this is a story this morning in The Times saying hospitals are preparing to cut spending on doctors and nurses by hundreds of millions of pounds They've been told to fine £4.5 billion because there's a hole in the NHS budget. They've been ordered to review staffing levels, draw up plans to close some services and merge others. The budget currently for the health service, just in England, by the way, is £165 billion. And when people say to me, oh, well, it's not enough money, they got 3.2% uplift in real terms between 2018-19 and again in 23-24. The junior doctor strike rumbles on, and they've just got a mandate for another 6 months. The cost, by the way, of those junior doctors' strikes is £1.5 billion.
Interesting.
It's a lot of money. Yeah. And meanwhile, a lot of people are not getting the treatment they want. What is going to happen? Because if they do win the election, Keir Starmer has to solve that junior doctor strike.
I mean, they've already received almost an 11% pay rise. They've got that. They're now asking for what, 30%?
35.
Yeah, 35%. As I've always said, the junior doctors have a cost of lifestyle crisis, not a cost of living crisis.
It's a good line.
I know, I do think it, because they should be happy with the 11%. They should take it and get back to work. The country needs them, and we can't keep footing the bill for them to keep striking when they are junior doctors. Career progression takes time. There are very few industries that you will start off on a 6-figure salary.
So, Jonathan, just in terms of that, how much of these strikes with Vivek Trivedi, Rob Lawrenson and so on is political to force the government's hand? Do you think they'll actually back down the minute Labour gets in?
I actually don't think it's political, because I think in some weird ways it benefits the Conservative Party. I think
Why?
Because I think the Conservative Party are just able to say, you know, these people are lazy, they're striking, they're not getting back to work, you know, they can sort of ignore it, push it down the road. The situation in the NHS gets worked, and people get fed up at the doctors rather than the government.
But Samara has just told you how much they've been given already. Also, just in terms of...
This isn't about them and whether it's right or wrong. This is about, like, the political game. I think the doctors are losing.
Well, the political game is that they've just offered them 8.1%, which will rise to 10.3%. So that's on top of what they've already been given. So what does Keir Starmer do? Does he actually say, fine, you can have 35%?
No, he's already said they won't.
Correct.
Yet.
So therefore... how much of this is politics, do you think?
You know, I think it's massively political. I think the BMA junior doctors bit of the BMA has actually been infiltrated by ex-Momentum people. That's a fact. And they want to bring down the government. I've always argued that they really don't need to, because the government are doing a great job of bringing down themselves. But that has been the aim. I will correct you, Samara, that no junior doctor starts on a six-figure salary.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, they should be happy that they should think about career progression.
They get
there, yes, I do.
Okay.
I do.
They don't start on it. But however, they don't start on £14 an hour either. That's a myth. So, you know, I think that it's totally political. They've already got a really good pay rise that no one else has seen. I certainly haven't had a pay rise for 5 years.
I certainly haven't.
And I think that it's for that reason alone, to demand 35%, to know that you're not going to get it, is political.
No, I think it's political in that they want more money, right? But I don't think I think they realise that I don't think they're big fans of Starmer at the BMA. I really don't.
No, I think they're probably not. I think you're right.
So, therefore, they're not trying to lever that if a Starmer government comes in, they'll simply get whatever they want, because they're probably outvoting for Green.
But do they think that they're more likely to get it under Starmer?
I don't think anyone thinks that they'll get the full package of what they're asking for, and that's normally how these things go with strikes and with this sort of leverage. It's almost never, I would imagine, that people really get the full demands. I remember when there was a whole series of strikes several months ago, when we were discussing about ambulance strikes, the police strikes, whatever it was. They weren't going to get anything. It's sort of the compromise, the middle ground. Yeah, the nurses, exactly.
And so, Samara, finally, if I can just ask you, is this the right time to be elected? Because if they get in, they're going to inherit a terrible situation in this country. They've got strikes, they've got all of these pay demands, we haven't got enough money, we've got a national debt which is through the roof. It's going to be trouble for Labour.
Yeah, especially for a Labour government and what ideologies they tend to run on. I think they love to spend, but clearly, you know, the Conservatives have been spending and it's not been working. So we need a lot of reform in all the different sort of industries and sectors. And yeah, Labour said they can help us, so let's see what they can do if they get in.
Let's see what happens indeed. Thank you very much to both of you. Jonathan Gibson, political commentator, Samara Gill, TikTok... Oh, no, just political commentator now, sorry.
How dare you?
And big love to Mirabai as well, who's outside.